Okay, and good morning, and it is good to be back with you this morning. Monday, I was here to introduce myself and also the topic of life choices, which are the decisions that you make that have the potential to impact not only the rest of your life, but the lives of those around you. I gave a number of examples, just to reiterate briefly, the alcohol, drugs, texting, and of course, kind of a catch-all, which is personal conduct. But in light of all of the allegations against so many in the present or at the present time regarding their conduct in terms of their interactions with women, I think that it's important to mention that as well. This morning I'm going to kind of unpack my story a little bit, and it deals on the topic of alcohol. So I'm going to briefly touch on those dangers, and then we'll move forward. Monday I mentioned that annually 2,700 teenagers die each year because of DUI traffic crashes. Every 31 to 51 minutes somebody dies due to a DUI crash, and that's because every 2 minutes at all age groups somebody is in a crash that is involving alcohol. Here in the Nashville area, to kind of bring it a little bit closer to home, on weekend nights after 10 p.m., 1 in 4 vehicles on the road is DUI. These are very significant numbers, and it wouldn't be a stretch to say that everyone in this room has probably been in some way affected by the use of alcohol. So again, this is a very personal topic for me. I share those numbers just to kind of set the stage, but full disclosure, you've probably heard those before. Those numbers were gleaned from radio and television PSAs, from a cursory internet search, and reading the local newspapers. But I share them also to make the point that if you're anything like me, oftentimes we read or hear those types of numbers, immediately determine for ourselves whether or not we believe they're applicable, and if not, they just kind of roll off and they're forgotten. And that's the reason I shared that last number, and that was the 25% of my life that I spent in prison behind one bad decision. If we could go to the next slide, please. The question, of course, is how did that happen? So I'm going to give you a little bit of my backstory. I grew up in Franklin. While occupying a chair similar to the one that you're in now, at your age, I was very active in school. Academically as well as athletically. I played multiple sports. From the time I was old enough, oftentimes during the summers I kept a part-time job. My parents were very involved in my life, in my academic, my athletic career, but they also were trying to prepare me for life, so that was one of the things that they did. They helped me with my first vehicle, but they told me that I had to keep a part-time job in the summers to insure it and put gas in it. Another aspect of my life is that I drank occasionally. I would have been characterized as a social drinker. I wasn't one to sit at home and drink by myself. It was in social settings. It was after football games. It was after wrestling matches. It was on the weekends with friends. I was just as comfortable consuming any type of alcohol as I was standing there with a bottle of water in my hand. I was just as often the sober driver at in these settings as I was drinking any type of alcohol. 99% of the time I did what was expected of me, what was required of me. It was that 1% that ultimately led to this story. What I just described could probably describe many of you. So the question is, how does somebody like that, somebody like myself, somebody like many of you, end up spending so much time in prison? If we could go to the next slide, please. This just has a few comments on it, but one being spring break. That's where my story began. But I would mention that it could have just as easily happened over the winter break. It could have just as easily happened over Thanksgiving. But it just so happened that it was spring break. Some friends and I had a mutual friend that he would rent us his condominium on the Gulf Coast, and during breaks from school, that's where we would vacation. So that's where I happened to find myself. I just turned 20 years old. I was a sophomore in college. I was just a couple years older than most of you sitting in this room this morning. However, I put myself squarely in the same demographic. I was there with the same friends. I was doing the same things that I was doing in high school. The only difference was we went to different schools. While there, we met up with the group that I was with met up with some mutual friends, some folks that I didn't know all that well, but the group that I was with did. They were staying about an hour and a half away in Panama City Beach. When I was in high school in the 1990s, MTV used to broadcast live every spring break from Panama City Beach. So it was a location that I was very much aware of. I had never been there myself. But I would say that it didn't take a whole lot of arm twisting when the group that I was with asked me as one of the drivers on this trip to drive over to make that trip. I can say that leaving that day, there were a number of what I would term signs from God to turn around. And I didn't. There was hurricane force winds. The island that we were staying on as we were coming over the bridge, it was rocking my vehicle back and forth to the point that we almost turned around then. The rains and winds were so fierce on the way to Panama City that at one point we just had to stop in the middle of the highway because I couldn't see. Once we got there, the road was closed because a roof had blown off of a local hotel. At that point, we actually did turn around, and much to my relief, if I'm being fully honest, I at this point just wanted to go back to our condo. But on our way back, one of my passengers saw the road crew putting up detour signs. And they talked me into taking that detour, and ultimately we made it to our destination. We met up with those mutual friends who had told us that we could stay at their hotel with them. And I, as one of the drivers, secured my keys. Having done what I thought was the responsible thing in this setting, by having a place to stay for the night, being put and securing my keys, I did what we'd gone over there to do, which was to have a good time, and that involved drinking. Panama City Beach was unlike anything I had ever experienced before. It was very much an outdoor carnival atmosphere. The rooms in the hotel were all open. People were out in the corridors and spilling out into the streets, just mingling and interacting. I can say that I was out of my element. But over the course of the evening, things went fairly smoothly up until just before midnight. At that point, I was out on the balcony of the hotel room, heard a commotion inside, came in to find one of our group, a young man by the name of Jason, lying on the floor. There was some blood on his forehead where he had obviously fallen. The commotion that alerted me on the balcony also alerted hotel security, who was roaming the hallways. The door, of course, was open, as were so many in this hotel, and security came in, and the first thing they did was they cleared the room out. The check-in policy at this particular hotel was that at check-in, paying guests would receive a wristband. Because we were not paying guests in this hotel room, we were told not only to leave the room but also the premises because we were trespassing. Not wanting to leave without finding out the extent of our friend's injuries, another young man in our group, Justin, and I made our way down to the parking lot. And in the matter of time that it took to get from a second-story hotel room to a ground-floor parking lot, I was able to reobtain my keys without any difficulty at all. There was absolutely nothing preventing me from getting behind the wheel. Full well knowing the potential consequences, which is the reason that when we did get into my truck, there was no intent to leave at that point. We were just going to wait out the commotion. We had been ordered off the premises, so we decided that we were just going to wait there until the commotion died down, and then we would regroup with our friends later. We didn't get that chance because from that vantage point in the parking lot, we saw an ambulance come up, and they, of course, were the EMTs were attending to Jason and ultimately loaded him in the back of that ambulance. And about the time that the ambulance was preparing to leave, the local police showed up. there was a whole lot of questions swirling around in the cab of that truck. There were questions of what had happened, what were the extent of Jason's injuries, because obviously it required a medical presence. How did he obtain those injuries, because obviously it required a legal presence. So in the matter of seconds that this was going on, the ambulance took off and I made the decision to follow. Again, full well knowing the potential consequences, but not truly believing that they applied to me. I had this mental image of that I'd conjured up of what I thought the typical drunk driver looked like. And in that moment, in that setting, that mental image was of the guys that I saw driving up and down the strip with a case of beer on the seat next to them, throwing beads out of the window at the young ladies walking by. And that wasn't me. So in my mind, I didn't think that the consequences applied either. It didn't take very long for me to realize the monumental mistake that was. If we could go to the next slide, please. This next image isn't of the best quality, but I think that it speaks for itself. This is a crime scene photograph that was taken by Bay County Beach police officers on the night of March 12, 2001. The investigators on the scene reconstructed the crash, and they determined that I had traveled 175 yards from the hotel parking lot that I'd just left. They also determined that I was traveling between 30 and 35 miles an hour. I was not speeding. I was not swerving. I was doing everything right, except that as I was merging with traffic, the vehicles ahead of me stopped, and I didn't. There were 5 occupants in the car ahead of me, and the 3 in the back seat were taken to the hospital because of the injuries that they received in this crash. Ultimately, 2 days later, the back middle seat passenger died as a direct result of my decision. If we could go to the next slide, please. The consequences for decisions and actions leading up ultimately to what you just saw. Guys, it's been almost 17 years since this happened. And I don't know that I can stand here today and adequately convey what all somebody goes through when they hear the words that they killed somebody because of their terrible decision. I can tell you that there is a whole lot of pain and shame and guilt and questions of why and how. I can tell you that I quickly found that I was not properly equipped to handle and process what I was experiencing, and to take it a step further, didn't know at my lowest points if I wanted to go on experiencing what I was. I can tell you that my coping mechanism was to suppress, to deal with things on my own, but I can tell you that you can only push down so much. There has to be a release somewhere, and for me, that ball of emotion that I was experiencing with and trying to press down ultimately began just eating me from the inside like a cancer. And these were just the emotional consequences that hit me in the immediate aftermath. The legal consequences were to follow. I was not arrested at the scene. I was taken to the hospital where the authorities obtained blood evidence. The district attorney was also at the hospital to ask questions. I was ultimately allowed to leave. And I was able to return here to my home in Franklin. But several months later, the legal consequences got into full swing. I came back to Franklin, but dealing with what I was effectively incapacitated. After a period of time, in order to return some sense of normalcy to my life, to fill my days and thoughts with anything other than this episode, I did return to work on a very limited basis, just a couple days a week, a couple hours at a time. I also I picked up a couple of evening classes at the local community college in Franklin. And it was actually there. I'd gone in one evening a little early to do some research in the library. And I received a phone call informing me that Williamson County Sheriff's deputies had been to my house with a search warrant as well as an arrest warrant, and that they were on their way to the school. This, of course, came out of nowhere. Well, not necessarily nowhere, but it was unexpected, because when I left Florida, I spoke with the district attorney. I also spoke with the police department, and they informed me that if and when charges were brought, they would inform me through my attorney, and I would be allowed to return myself to Florida to face those charges. That obviously was not the case, because by the time I got from the library to the common area of this little satellite facility that I was at, I could see out the front door, the back door, and down a side corridor, and it was apparent that sheriff's deputies had surrounded the building. They arrested me in the parking lot. They transported me to the Williamson County Jail facility, where I was held without bond until I was extradited back to the state of Florida. Ultimately, 6 months later, I was sentenced to 10 years in prison, followed by 10 years of probation for 1 count of DUI manslaughter, 1 count of DUI resulting in an injury, and 1 count of DUI resulting in a serious bodily injury. For those of you unfamiliar with incarceration, I can tell you that what you see on television, what you see in the movies, is oftentimes a somewhat accurate depiction, but more often than not, that's a PG version. Prison's a very violent place, and it is full of people that have lost all hope. And some of the most dangerous individuals you might encounter are those that have absolutely nothing to live for. And there was no distinction made between myself, who was incarcerated due to a spring break DUI crash, and those that I was housed with that were serving out multiple life sentences for various heinous crimes. If we could go to the next slide, please. So those are the consequences that I myself faced, and rightly so, because it was my decision to drive that night, full well knowing the consequences, but not believing that they applied to me. I wish that the story ended there, but it doesn't, because these life choices not only affect you, but they also affect those around you. So I'm going to pivot slightly, and I'm going to speak about the effects on those closest to me. This is a picture of my family. This was taken the Christmas of 2001. It was the first Christmas that I was incarcerated. I was in a prison facility just outside of Daytona Beach, Florida. Every one of those emotional consequences that I described, my family was experiencing something very similar. They too were experiencing that pain, shame, and just these thoughts of, how did this happen? How did our son make this horrible decision? Again, for me, my coping mechanism was to press down, to deal with this on my own. That's not the case for everybody. I can say that for my mother, the just distress that she was experiencing ultimately manifested itself in the form of uncontrollable physical tremors. When she has a headache, my mother will just as often refuse a Tylenol as take one, because she just doesn't like to take a lot of medication in general. But because she couldn't stop shaking, she had to get a prescription for an anti-anxiety medication just so she could sleep a few hours at night. That was a very eye-opening experience for me when I looked upon the face of someone that I care very much about and saw that she was unable to stop physically shaking because of something that I had done. In addition to the emotional consequences, there was a financial burden that was placed upon them. Again, I was a kid when this happened. I just turned 20 years old. I did not have any assets to speak of my own. So the financial burden that comes with attorney's fees and legal fees and being part of a case that is being played out 2 states away, that fell squarely upon those close enough to me that were willing to shoulder that burden. I can tell you that it was not cheap. This isn't something that you can just hire an attorney and it goes away. From the day this occurred, throughout this entire process, I've had 7 attorneys represent me. This isn't something, that attorneys are typically rated in stars. My first attorney that represented me had 6 months prior to accepting my case won the Supreme Court case dealing specifically with DUI manslaughter cases. He was the absolute best attorney in the state of Florida that could have represented me in this case. And ultimately, it was very expensive, but the outcome was 10 years in prison, followed by 10 years of probation. And that was one of 7. Just a few years ago, as part of a DUI class, I we were estimating the total economic impact of that, what it was that got us there. This was first and second time DUI offenders. For most DUI, first time it was in the thousands of dollars. Second time was tens of thousands. I had about 2 minutes for this exercise, and I was able to calculate well into seven figures. This isn't, and let me reiterate that those are dollars that I didn't have. That burden, or the lion's share of it, of those expenses that went out, fell squarely upon my family. I want to draw your attention to the young girl in the front of this image. This is my sister Jessica. She was 11 years old when this happened. Unfortunately, because of me, she doesn't have a lot of the typical childhood memories that most of us have, of Christmas mornings and Thanksgiving dinners and spring break vacations, because during those breaks from school, she was in a prison visiting park, very similar to this one, getting to know me. If we could go to the next slide, please. That's that same young girl taken about a year and a half prior to my release. As you can see, she grew up. And I show this image because I think that it makes a statement in itself. We're siblings. We grew up in the same house, same parents, same expectations, same morals, same values, same support system. My decisions sent me to prison. Her decisions led to her ultimately graduating valedictorian from BGA, going on to graduate summa cum laude for her undergrad, simultaneously completing an MBA as well as a professional degree in the medical field, and she's currently a clinical pharmacist at Wake Forest University. So this isn't something that you can say, oh, you're a product of your environment. The truth is, the road that we travel is bifurcated, and to stay on the straight and narrow, there's a series of choices that you must make in order to stay on the right path. She did, and I didn't. The picture on the right is my brother. When all this happened, he was an 18-year-old college freshman. By the time I was released, he was married, had one child, and his wife was pregnant with their second. This is my nephew as well as my namesake, and this is the day that I met him. If we could go to the next slide, please. I'm going to kind of just run through this very briefly, but I don't want you to think that the story ends there either. I'm now going to introduce you to Marilyn Aguia. In the spring of 2001, Marilyn was an 18-year-old high school senior, extremely intelligent, top of her class, duly enrolled in high school as well as college. She'd been accepted to the University of Florida at Gainesville, intended to graduate high school in the spring, was set to begin studying business at Florida in the fall. Had dreams of one day completing her degree, getting married, having a family, hopes and dreams that I'm sure everyone in this room has had at one time or will. I played a significant role in those dreams when they were completely obliterated the morning that Marilyn died as a direct result of my actions. Just as my family was forced to endure a set of consequences alongside me, Marilyn's family was forced to endure an unimaginable set of consequences alongside her. The difference being that my family knew that someday I was coming home, and her family knew that she would never come home. I had the opportunity to speak to her family the morning that I was sentenced. They, of course, had a lot of questions for me. I was able to share a lot of what I've shared with you this morning with them. I got to give them the backstory. They wanted to know why I was on the road. I got to tell them the whole story, why I was out. Thought I was being there for a friend. I thought I was okay to drive. Justin had even asked me before we left. I hadn't consumed any alcohol in a few hours leading up to this. I'd been down at the pool and then out on the balcony. I thought I was okay. The problem was, there's a zero tolerance law in the state of Florida. I was underage, had consumed alcohol, and therefore was guilty of being intoxicated. I don't have time to go through all the details of all of that, but suffice it to say, do your research. Laws are different from one place to another, and ultimately it doesn't matter what the laws were when you're standing in front of the mother and the sister and the cousin of a girl that you killed because of your bad decisions. Shortly after this conversation took place, Marilyn's cousin came up to me and she told me that they didn't think that I was a bad person. They thought that I'd made a terrible decision. However, they could never forgive me. To this day, through their attorneys, they've requested that I have no contact. I believe that I am out of time. This story does go on, and I do just want to leave you on a more positive note. There is, of course, a silver lining. We all experience tumultuous times in our lives. But the reality is that when we do fall down, when we stumble, when we make mistakes, life goes on, and it's up to us to keep up. I made a decision that ended in tragedy, but immediately afterwards I made a series of decisions that were far better. And I am currently experiencing the benefits and rewards of those better decisions. Those decisions ultimately led me to being released early by then Governor Jeb Bush through executive clemency. I was allowed to return here to Tennessee under an interstate compact agreement as I carried out the balance of my term on parole and probation. Since that time, I went back to school, completed my degree. I've found success in my career. I've gotten married. My wife and I built a house in Franklin a few years ago. We welcomed our first baby daughter about 2 years ago, and we're expecting a second child within the next 2 months. I've been on both sides, guys. I've experienced the temporary pleasure that unwise decisions can bring about. I've also experienced the benefits and rewards that making good decisions, no matter how difficult, challenging, unpopular they may be. And I can tell you that the benefits and rewards of making good decisions so far outweigh the temporary pleasure that unwise decisions provide. They're not even on the same field. And I would encourage all of you to make good decisions. They say that a smart person learns from their mistakes and that a wise person learns from the mistakes of others. I learned from my mistakes, but the reason I'm here, the reason I relive this every time I share it, is that I hope that you will learn from my mistakes as well. We've unpacked a lot of this. Hopefully this is enough to generate a conversation, get you thinking about your future and the decisions that will be presented. There is much more. I will be here for a few moments afterwards. I know you have class to get to, but if you want to stop by and say hi afterwards, I'd be happy to answer any questions. I have exceeded time, but I thank you for your time and attention this morning. Best of luck to you all.